All right, so he just finished talking about in chapter 7 about marriage, which seems to be this issue that came up. And it's interesting. So the issues that he's going to talk about that seem to be most of pressing concern are related to sexual immorality, porneia in the Greek word, and idolatry and food sacrificed to idols, which, as noted before, if we look at Acts 15, the last book we read, the chronology there is Acts 15. This is the Jerusalem Council. So Paul is already out. He's already gone out on his first missionary trip. And these questions are arising about these Gentiles, Greeks, who are becoming Christians. And, what exactly applies to them and doesn't apply to them of Jewish laws and Jewish tradition. And so Paul is, and in Acts 15, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit after the apostles get together. They read thoroughly, and here's there's all this background stuff that kind of shapes how we should understand things. But we kind of live now in this era post Martin Luther, post Luther, and Luther. He tended to divide up the Old Testament. So in his mind, the categories were, he was trying to struggle with this idea of, how much of the Old Testament law applies. And he set up this kind of stark contradiction between the law and gospel. And he sees Paul as the main advocate for this kind of stark contrast between the law and the gospel. The law has passed away and the gospel is here. But the problem is that some things that Paul says do tend to sound that way, but other places he says the opposite. He says, the law is of great benefit, and it's a great privilege that the Jews have that they receive the law first, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, it's kind of questionable, Luther's distinction. And then so what he did was, he tended to divide up the Old Testament law into three categories, right? So he said, all right, there are three kinds of laws in the Old Testament in his view. One was the cultic or sacrificial law, so the law about how to worship, basically. The ceremonial laws, he sometimes calls it. The second one was the kind of civil laws, because there wasn't this distinction between civil and religious. They were all together, and the law of Moses contains a lot of civil codes as well. It contains animal husbandry codes, right? Which we're going to see actually in the next chapter. It contains all kinds of regulations. So Luther kind of divided them up and said, well, what applies still and what doesn't apply still? So you have the civil, the ceremonial, and then the third category is the moral law. And basically he said the ceremonial and the civil law have gone away, but the moral law is what remains, right? So this is kind of an artificial distinction that Paul may not have shared. So anyway, this can be a really complicated issue for us to kind of go back through history and try to understand what's going on here. But the interesting thing is, again, with Acts 15, so this comes up as an issue early on in Paul's ministry after his first missionary trip. It kind of comes to a head, and according to Acts timeline and chronology, comes to a head in Acts 15. And then Paul doesn't arrive in Corinth until Acts 17, until after the Jerusalem Council. He's not even there for the first time. Then he stays there about 18 months. He leaves, and this letter is written perhaps as much as 2 years after he left Corinth while he's in Ephesus. So now, according to the timeline with Acts, even Paul's first visit there was after this issue was already decided. And what did they do? They didn't throw away the law. They didn't say, well, there's the moral law and the cultic law and the ceremonial law, civil law. They said, they did a close reading, actually, of the Old Testament. Leviticus, the Holiness Code in Leviticus, chapter 17 forward to about 23, I think. And there, all these laws, this holiness laws of what was commanded the sons of Israel, they went in, they explored where does God apply these laws to everyone who is residing within Israel, including non-Jews. Jews. And there were really four things, and they all boiled down to sexual immorality, forbidding sexual immorality, and forbidding idolatry and food, basically, that had been sacrificed to idols or had blood in it. All right, so it's interesting that these, and then circumcision is another huge issue. And so it's interesting that some of these huge issues are the ones that are coming up here. And very interesting. So Paul already knows that this issue has been decided, but look how he treats it, right? He doesn't treat it as an absolute rule. Even in these most important issues that they decided, okay, these are the ones that you have to concentrate on. He's willing to throw these out as well. And I think that's what I mentioned at the end of last time was this, this is part of the Orthodox way of thinking, the mind of Christ that Paul talks about. So it's not just about what we know and knowledge. It's about how we use it. It's about our ethos behind it. All right, so here he says, so he's just finished talking about marriage, and the underlying conclusion basically is that he says, look, it would be better in general if you're not attached, stay not attached, stay not married, so that you can devote yourself fully to the Lord and avoid conflict. But it's no sin by any means to get married, because it's a special call to be celibate. So it's not a sin to marry, and it's not a sin not to marry. So that was an important point. All right, so now he says, now concerning things offered to idols. So he's going down this list of the things that they wrote him in the letter. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. We know that, and look here in the RSV, we know that, quote, all of us possess knowledge, end quote. So this is where kind of the problems begin. Is he, again, remember, he's quoting slogans of theirs or things that they've asserted in their letter to him, such as probably when they say all things are lawful to me. He's quoting that, but then he adds, but not all things are profitable. So he tends to start out with agreeing to an extent with the opponent's position, but then he's going to introduce some nuance and how they're applying this. So he says, we know that we all have knowledge. So to me, it probably is a quote that he's quoting, because he says, we know that we have knowledge. It's kind of, if he's not quoting, it's kind of a strange construction. So he's affirming what they say when they say all of us possess knowledge. All of them have been enlightened. And what's the background here? So the ancient world in general at this time is very interested in these keywords that keep popping up throughout the letter: knowledge, gnosis, wisdom, Sophia, and logos, speech, something like that, persuasive kind of speech. And so he says, okay, yeah, we all have knowledge, because it seems the guess is that there's a group in Corinth that is kind of Gnostic in their outlook. So what do we mean by Gnostic? And this was Gnosticism was one of these things that it was kind of like almost like a virus in the ancient world. And this idea kind of infiltrated all kinds of things, all kinds of philosophies, and kind of seeped in to the way people saw things. So this Gnosticism basically posited that, there's certain knowledge that only certain people have been gifted with. And this kind of revelatory knowledge gives them some kind of special insight or some kind of special freedoms. All right, so what is this? All right, so we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge, however, gnosis, puffs up, but love edifies. So let's see. Ignosis physi. So again, this word physi is breath, something like that, but the spirit, right? But he's saying that your this kind of spirit that you have is more like hot air. This is kind of the play on words that he's making. So your kind of spiritual knowledge is the kind that's puffing you up, that's making you full of hot air. But love edifies. All right, so there's two things going on here. There's really two issues at play here. One is the knowledge, the content of the knowledge, which Paul's going to agree with them to a certain extent. The second part is the behavioral issue. So there's a cognitive issue and there's a behavioral issue. So it's really, he agrees with them to a point with the first issue where we're going to see it. Where he's challenging them, where he wants to correct them, is in their application of this, how they're doing it. And remember, this 1 Corinthians in chapter 13 coming up is the famous chapter on love. So Paul's going to return to this knowledge of how love edifies, builds up, eikodomi, which is one of his favorite words to describe the church, building up the church. So love builds up the church. Love edifies the church, which he's going to repeat in 1 Corinthians 13. 2, and if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet, as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. So he's saying, it's almost kind of think of Socrates. Socrates was this paragon of wisdom, but then what's his conclusion? There's only one thing I know, that I know nothing, right? So this humility. So Paul's kind of playing in that kind of vein, like, okay, you guys have all this special knowledge and special revelation, etc. You think you know something, but really you don't know anything. So it's not the content of their knowledge, it's the issue. It's the way they're acting with it that's the problem. So he's trying to humble them. The issue is their pride and their arrogance toward other members, toward Paul, toward other members of the community. But Paul says, but if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. So, and he's going to underline the fact that no one knows God, right? It's impossible. Even Paul, who was taken up into the third heaven and heard things and saw things which neither eye nor ear has heard, that he can't express in human words that are prepared for those who love him. He's saying, you guys are talking about all this stuff about God and God's ways and et cetera, but really you don't know anything. You're still immature. You've been given knowledge that's probably too much for you in your level of maturity. And really, it's not about what you know. It's about who knows you. And the way that you're known by God is through love. 4. All right, so therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world. And here, it's in the RSV, again, they have this as a quote, which I think is probably right. We know that, quote, that an idol has no real existence, end quote. And that, quote, there is no God but one. So he's probably quoting assertions they made, and that this is part of the content of the special gnosis or knowledge that they think they have. And there's no other God but one. 5, for even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we live. All right, so he's saying, he's repeating their statement that, okay, yes, an idol has no real existence, not really a God, right? And there's no God but one, affirming the Jewish monotheism. And this is the famous Jewish phrase, the Shema. Have you guys heard of this from Deuteronomy, that they would repeat every day as part of their prayers? And almost something like the Jesus prayer for us. The Shema was from Deuteronomy 6:4, I think, where Shema is the Hebrew word which means hear. So it's the first word in this phrase: hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And the Hebrew originally was, hear, O Israel, Yahweh your God, Yahweh is one. But that's the original. But over time in Jewish tradition, they became wary of pronouncing the name of God. So in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, 300 years before Christ, already they had switched that, and they used the Greek word Kyrios, Lord, because they didn't want to use the name Yahweh. So we usually know this as, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So he's using this phrase. The people there are repeating this, and they're saying, look, we know now that we've become Christian, we've been baptized, we've been given this knowledge that there are no other gods, right? That there's only one God. And these are probably, this group that's talking and is advocating for their freedom to eat meat is probably kind of the socially elite group in Corinth that probably has an extensive pagan background, right? So it's very much part of their worldview to have these pagan sacrifices, etc. And they're saying, well, we know that it's not true. I mean, we know that it's nothing. So what difference does it make if we eat food that they sacrifice to the so-called idol? All right. And then he says, for even if there are so-called gods, and here is a really difficult phrase. So Father Stephen DeYoung, we read his book, The Religion of the Apostles. He points out, right, but what it actually says here in the Greek is legomeni, which means called, right? Kegar iper isin legomeni thei. So even if there are gods even if there are things that are called gods, it can mean so-called, but it doesn't have to have this negative pejorative sense, right? So in other words, I don't think he's really saying one way or the other whether they're real or not, but he's acknowledging that people call them gods and they're not what they seem to be. That's what he says. But the English translation here is kind of misleading, and it's probably, Father Stephen argues, that it's a result of this turn in the modern world. So in the 17th century, scholars, especially the Western scholars, got very interested in this idea of monotheism, and really that word had never been used before the 17th century. So this modern idea of monotheism that we've inherited is a little bit different than the way that they thought in the ancient world. So we tend to inherit this as a strict monotheism, right? And so, at least for me growing up in a kind of Protestant milieu, that was the impression I had also, that all these other so-called gods just have no real existence at all. They're completely figments of human imagination, the products of culture, etc. But there's nothing behind them at all, because there only exists one kind of spiritual being, and that's God. But that is not actually how the ancient world thought, or the ancient Christians thought. They thought more in terms of and the Greeks too by this time they were acknowledging, yes, there is one supreme God, but then they had different opinions about how these other beings, deities, related to God. Now, God was the only one who had real existence in and of himself, but there are all these spiritual beings, like we read in the Old Testament about the angels. You have the fallen angels, you have the angels that remain faithful to God. These are spiritual beings in some way. And then even in the Old Testament, God says to Moses, before the Exodus, he says, "This night I will judge the gods of Egypt." Right? This night I will judge the gods of Egypt. So, is he saying there in the Old Testament, I'm going to judge these figments of the Egyptians' imagination that aren't real at all? No, he's saying, more in line with what Father Stephen says in Religion of the Apostles, that there are these, and this was the belief in the ancient world, even among the Jews, that there were all these kind of angelic beings, for lack of a better word, that played some kind of mediating role. I mean, Paul actually says elsewhere, he says that the law was mediated to Moses through angels, which actually is not what it says in the Old Testament. That was a common kind of rabbinic belief at that point. So anyway, so this whole idea, it's not exactly that Paul's saying they're complete figments of imagination and have no reality whatsoever. He's just saying that they're not gods in the sense that people think they are. And in fact, later, so he's going to talk about this. He's going to go on what appears to be a digression in chapter 9, and then he's going to circle back to this in chapter 10. And then chapter 10, he's going to state clearly that they're demons. They're demons. So that by participating, and he's going to say, he's going to prohibit participation in these sacrifices, these pagan sacrifices, because by eating of them, you're communing with demons. So it's not that it's nothing. It's not what they think it is, but there is still a spiritual reality. Does that make sense? So, I mean, it's kind of a nuance here, but so he's saying for even if there are things that people call gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords. So he seems to contradict himself if we read the English straight, but he's saying there are many things that people call gods and lords, but they're actually demons. And then when he says whether on heaven or on earth, there was St. John Chrysostom and St. Theophylact say that the gods in heaven, these were the so-called gods in heaven, are these angelic beings, and that the ones on earth, or the angelic beings and ones who control, for example, the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, and then there were also on earth these kind of spiritual beings that were assigned to the rivers, to the lake, etc. So he's acknowledging that there is something. There are these angelic beings, these demonic beings, etc., but they're not what people think they are. Because for us, there is one God, and this is called really before the 17th century, they didn't use this term monotheism. There was the idea of polytheism for sure, and then there was the idea of henotheism. They call it henotheism, which is from the Greek word ena meaning one, but not mono. So basically, henotheism was the idea that for us, there's one God. For us, there's one God, as opposed to the pagans. It's not taking that next step and denying any reality to these other spiritual entities that monotheism does. Does that make sense? So that kind of confuses things a little bit for us. And then here, this 6, he says, and you see all these italicized words, which means those are supplied, those are put in. Yet for us there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him. This is probably a better translation here. Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. So you see already the beginnings of a Trinitarian kind of formula, talking about that God is created, that everything comes from God the Father, but it's through Jesus Christ. So this is the later, it becomes more explicit in the church's theology later, the Trinitarian nature, and that God created the world through Christ, that he was this figure that the Greeks would have called the Logos, the Demiurge, this other spiritual being through whom God created and fashioned the world. And it's interesting here, some people say there's a kind of rhythm here in the Greek in verse 6. And some people see this, Paul, as kind of playing with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And that he's kind of playing with the wording here in Greek and Christianizing it, tweaking the wording a little bit to Christianize it and include Jesus Christ and the relationship between Christ and the Father. So some people say that I mean, it sounds so it sounds like a neat formula that's related to the Shema, that it could be that Paul is quoting here an already existing something like a creed. And we know that there was in the first century various pieces of creedal statements that the Christians had already developed and that they were using in baptism probably. So it kind of sounds like he's quoting something that already existed, or he's coining it now in a moment of inspiration. All right, 7. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge. Or, this is translation's better here, the RSV. However, not all possess this knowledge. So he agrees with them. He quotes them and say, we know that all have knowledge, all possess knowledge. And then he says, okay, and this knowledge that we're talking about specifically has to do with to what extent do these idols have a real existence, etc. And he's kind of acknowledging, yeah, you have a point that, they're not what people think they are, etc. But then he says, however, not all possess this knowledge. So you're saying that everyone has this awareness or this knowledge, but Paul's saying, well, not all are convinced of this or possess it in the same way you do. But some, he says, in fact, through being hitherto accustomed to idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. All right, so being hitherto accustomed. So All right, and this is where we can say a little bit about what's the background in Corinth. So Corinth, is a Christian community. It's in a major metropolitan city, something like Las Vegas or something, with a bit of a sordid reputation. And the community there is almost certainly composed of some combination of Gentiles and Jews. Now, the Jews, for example, would have been Hellenized Jews. You're not likely to have people who have recently immigrated to Corinth from Palestine, but rather Jews that had been living in the diaspora for a while, maybe a couple hundred years, maybe 100 years, and had assimilated in some sense. They were Hellenized. These Jews were assimilated. So we have this idea about circumcision was an issue there, and that some of the Jews, the Hellenized Jews who grew up in this Greco-Roman pagan culture, were ashamed of their circumcision, and for kind of social networking reasons, pursued this kind of medical procedure that would make it appear that they weren't circumcised. So there's some combination of Hellenized Jews who have assimilated to the wider pagan culture, perhaps some Jews more like Paul who have a more traditional understanding, and then you have certainly Gentiles, Greeks who grew up in a pagan culture, right, where everything was integrated. All these religious rituals were integrated into everyday life, and the foremost way in this particular case is regarding meat sacrificed to idols. And again, here's the variety in Corinth too, that we probably have different social classes altogether in this Christian community in Corinth, which was unusual for the ancient world. Usually people stuck with their own social classes. Christianity was radical in this way, but some people were still operating in a worldly sense where they still were making distinctions based on social class. So this group that seems to be pushing the most for, hey, I got all this knowledge, I know that idols are nothing, I can go and eat meat, seemed to probably be mainly the socially elite who are more influenced by the pagan culture. It could include some wealthy Jews who are more assimilated as well, perhaps those who wanted to hide their circumcision, etc. So the problem is that in the pagan world at that time, basically all meat was sacrificed to idols. So this is another point that Father Stephen brings up. And when we now moderns hear about sacrifice, we tend to think about the killing of the animal, that something takes place in the killing of the animal. But in the ancient world, the killing, even for the Jews, the killing was a lot of times secondary, right? What was really happening in the ritual was that there was a common meal with the god. There was a common meal with the god, and that the eating together of this food indicated communion with one another and with the god, right? And in this way, Christianity slides right in and has the same kind of basic concept that we are eating of the messianic banquet at the end of time with the Messiah, Christ, our God. We're achieving communion with each other and him, and that he himself is the sacrifice. Now, that's the part that Christianity introduces that's a radical twist. But the basic concept is the same, that we achieve this union by eating a meal with the God. All right, so in the ancient world, the sacrifice was really secondary because it was just a kind of a no-brainer that you didn't slaughter an animal until you had a reason to, right? So it wasn't like there was a factory of animals where they're, packaging them in cellophane and styrofoam, right? And that all we have to sacrifice is, getting a styrofoam thing of meat and sacrifice the styrofoam and the cellophane, and now we have the meat, right? The killing is forgotten in our culture because it's kind of distasteful. But in the ancient world, you had to kill something in order to eat, right? So the killing is kind of secondary, but they would do it. So any kind of meat that they would have, they would offer it to a god, right, as part of a daily sacrifice. And there was the element also of appeasing the gods. And so normally what you do is the pagan priest would kill the animal, and it was almost like he was almost like the butcher as well, like a secular butcher, but also combined with a pagan priestly function. Does that make sense? So it was just the way people got meat in the ancient world, and most of the time it was pigs. Pigs were the most common. We know that from, digging up the bones, etc. And of course, for the Jews, this would present multiple problems. For the Jews, pigs are an unclean food, first of all, but then the sacrifice to idols. So the Jewish community before Christianity in cities like Corinth would have probably had if they had any sizable Jewish community at all, they would have probably had their own markets, right? Their own markets where meat was killed according to the Jewish tradition, not sacrificed to idols, etc. When Christianity comes along, you have all these pagans, Gentiles also joining Christianity, and they are used to the old way of doing things. They don't necessarily think of it as purely religious, right? So it's almost like, I'm trying to think of some example, like in the modern world, we have this notion in American culture in general, so let's say society in general, that if someone thinks of a wedding, right, they think of, even if they're not religious at all, they tend to think, oh, well, you got to have a minister there, and it's vaguely Christian or vaguely religious, right? Even if the people themselves, they don't care, they don't believe anything in specific, right? It's just the way our culture does weddings. That's a wedding to them. So it was almost, I think, the same thing for the ancient pagans too, that okay, yeah, they sacrificed it to a god, but I mean, okay, whatever, it's still meat. That was just the way it was processed. That was the way it was butchered. And especially if they were the poorer members, they would eat meat very rarely because meat was expensive. So, okay, so I say all this just so that we can get a better understanding of what he's going to talk about here. So some with consciousness of the idol until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol. So in other words, primarily these pagan Gentiles who become Christian, they've grown up in a culture where from their birth, they've associated the meat with the sacrifice to the idol. Now they become Christian, and perhaps they're Christian now. Paul's writing 2 years after he visited Corinth. Perhaps they're Christian now for 2 years since Paul baptized them or brought them into the church, only 2 years. And he's saying, okay, you guys, you more wealthy elite who are used to circulating in these circles where there are these constant banquets, right? And that it was like the social network too, that, for example, every trade guild, like if you were a tent maker, like Paul was, there would be a tent maker guild, a union, and they would adopt some god as the patron god of this guild, this association, right? And so when they would get together for maybe a monthly meeting or whatever, they would meet in the temple of that particular god. They would offer this sacrifice, and then the temple would actually have dining rooms attached to the temple. So they would sacrifice the meat to the god, some quick ritual, they would butcher, they would cook it, and then they would eat this meal together with the god to whom they had nominally dedicated this animal. Does that make sense? So it didn't necessarily mean you believed, for the pagans, it didn't necessarily mean you believed in the god. It was just, that was something you did. That was just the culture. People might have believed it, people might not have, but it was like, it's us going for a business lunch, right? Or some, monthly meeting of pastors that I have or something like that. I mean, it's just a meeting, basically. All right. So basically he's saying these people have grown up in this pagan world where they've grown to associate this kind of eating of meat in general with pagan worship, and they can't shake it, right? They've only been Christian for 2 years. They don't have the Jewish background some of you guys have, which had always emphasized stay away from idolatry, stay away from idolatry. They don't know. They don't have that same mentality you do, so it doesn't bother them that they just don't even, those Jews who had already established the separation, we don't get involved in idolatry, have a different mentality than the pagans, right, who are coming in. And he's saying to these pagans, okay, yeah, you've heard the message of Christianity, you heard correctly, I did say that, we're free in Christ now, etc. But not everyone thinks the way you do. There are also perhaps these Jewish believers, or I'm rather sorry, there are perhaps also some believers who, in their mind, for whatever reason, either they grew up in the culture as pagans and they can't shake it, or they grew up as Jews in a pagan culture and we're just constantly told, stay away from idolatry, stay away from idolatry. He said these people can't just snap their fingers and get over this mentality. In their mind, in their conscience, when they see someone or the prospect of eating food that they know has been sacrificed to idols, sometimes they don't know, but when they know it's been sacrificed to idols, there's a twinge in their conscience. They're bothered. There's something that tells them, this doesn't seem right. And so, okay, you have a knowledge, you don't have that same kind of predisposition. Paul's not making really a judgment on which one's better. He's trying to avoid that, but he's saying for them, right or wrong, their conscience is bothering them when they're eating meat or when they see someone else eating meat because of this association they've had. So verse 8, but food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. So this is, to me, a radical statement. I mean, this is one of the main issues of Jewish identity, eating food sacrificed to idols, eating pig, which is most likely the case. And Paul's saying, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Circumcision doesn't matter. Food sacrificed to idols doesn't matter. These were huge. These were the biggest issues of the day. And he's saying they don't matter. So how do we understand that? And then I try to think of, and throughout church history, the church has always kind of looked on this section for the larger principle of what Paul is talking about. So, we can try to think of what are some analogies in our own day that we could compare it to. And I'm not suggesting there's like a one-to-one correspondence, but one thing that comes to mind that I've thought about frequently over the last couple months, as I get sick of hearing people debate about masks, right? So people, you got lately the one side that is saying, for example, it's an affront to wear masks in the altar. This has actually been a debate over the last few months. And they say, look, I don't want to wear a mask in the altar because I believe that Jesus Christ is really there in the bread and wine, that he becomes really present in the body and blood, and that communion, I don't accept the idea of using a different spoon or something like that, because I really believe that's his body and blood. And if it can, cleanse sins, then it can certainly cleanse some germs, some virus, okay? Or they say, I'm not going to wear a mask in the altar because this is a holy space and it just would not be possible for something corrupting to be transmitted here. Okay, and you can say, okay, that's a commendable belief. Okay, that's what you believe. You have that knowledge, right? That's the knowledge that you possess. Okay, I'm not arguing with you one way or the other, whether that's true or not. It's a pious belief. The question, though, is, and this is the crux of the issue, is how are you acting because of this knowledge? And if in this particular case with the masks, you're constantly creating problems, you're constantly criticizing the people who wear a mask, you're making some big, throwing some big temper tantrum about it or whatever, how is that helpful, right? All things are lawful. Okay, you don't want to wear a mask, don't wear a mask. But how is your behavior about it helping anything? How is it building up people? And in fact, it's causing probably some people to be offended, to stumble, etc. Now, this isn't an exact analogy, but all right, so this is where he's going to go in verse 9. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. So in my mind, he's not, he's kind of agreeing with some other principles. He's kind of agreeing that, idols aren't what people think they are. You're right in that sense. So, okay. But he says that's not really the important issue. Let's say you're right. Let's say, we're totally in agreement on that. The problem is how you're using it. Beware lest somehow this liberty of yours, and this was the key word, right? Everyone was talking about their freedom. And for them, freedom meant rights, right? So, but Paul is pushing back against is this kind of exaltation of rights and individual rights, right? He's saying, okay, yeah, you have a right. You have a right not to wear a mask. Okay, but the question is, how should you use that right? Right? He's saying, beware lest this liberty of yours, which is not challenging, you have that liberty, become a stumbling block to those who are weak. And it's not clear when he says weak, because sometimes in Paul's letters, he uses these words ironically. They seem to be words that were common among philosophers, Stoics. The Corinthians are probably using these words, the strong and the weak. And Paul may be using them kind of in quotes. They're describing themselves as the strong ones because they have this knowledge, right? And those who are troubled, their conscience is troubled by this, they're the weak ones. So he's saying, okay, let's say you have this right, fine. But if it becomes a stumbling block to others, then it's a problem. All right, but here there's an important distinction too, because sometimes we could translate that in our modern terms now is, we're in the area now, living in the era now where everyone is always offended, right? Everyone is always offended. So it's easy for us in our own context kind of jump to the conclusion that, all right, if you're offending anybody with your behavior, then you need to stop. And that's not what Paul says. What he's saying is that if your behavior is leading others to emulate your behavior, despite their reservations at some point in their conscience, something's telling them this doesn't feel right, but they're being kind of led by you to emulate your behavior in being free and eating this meat and joining in the banquets, etc., then that's the sin. Right? That's the sin, because you've caused them to sin against their own conscience. And he's not even saying that it's an actual sin. He's saying they've sinned because something in their conscience is telling them it's wrong. And you are kind of pressuring them, especially if they're the social elite and these are the poorer members, you're kind of pressuring them to act against their conscience. And that's a sin. Why are you putting them in this kind of uncomfortable position? If that's what they believe, that's what they believe. So it's not just that they're offended. Okay, people can be offended, but it's that you may actually lead them to do something. You may lead them to violate their own conscience. So therefore he says in verse 10, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge, eating in an idol's temple. Now this is interesting. So in the archaeological evidence from Corinth, we know there were all these temples in Corinth, in the marketplace, the agora. Corinth, is a city kind of down closer to the sea level, but right behind it is this mountain that goes up. It's called Acrocorinth, and part of the city extended up this kind of mountain, and that's where a lot of the temples also were located. So, for example, there's one temple they've uncovered to Demeter on the road up Acrocorinth, that they found in the ruins that there's a temple to Demeter where they would where they would slaughter or sacrifice the animal, cut it up, etc. And that there were 40 dining rooms attached to the temple, and that they were all actually located at the entrance level. So meaning that people who walked by the road could actually see who was in there eating. There were 40 little dining rooms, almost like picture a restaurant with different kind of sections, right? And each one, party could reserve a different room. So people could actually walk by and see maybe this wealthy pagan who's now become Christian. He's in there yucking it up with his buddies and his trade union at this pagan banquet, while this poor believer walks up to go, tend to his field or whatever. And the poor Christian believer is scandalized. What's he doing in there with pagans? All right, so for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? So again, it's not just that he's offended, okay? That's fine, you can be offended. But if it pressures him to do something that he doesn't feel comfortable doing, right? If the social pressure, because you're the lead and you're saying, well, we have knowledge. If you really have knowledge of Christ, then you'll just go ahead and eat this meat. And they're feeling pressured to do it, but something's telling them it doesn't seem right. And again, Paul's not making a judgment who's right. He's saying, don't pressure. All right, 11. And because of your knowledge, shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? So now he's getting a little pointed or sarcastic, and you get the sense clearly that it doesn't matter who's right. What matters is love. What matters is love. So, yeah, I mean, yeah. And this happens a lot. I mean, in our church, this is the Pharisee and the publican. This is the tendency in all religion that we're going to make the religion an ideology and use it as a club to beat others with, right? That's not the point. He's kind of warning us against this kind of Pharisaism. But he's saying, look at what it accomplishes. Does it build up? Does it involve love? 12, but when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ, because the church is Christ's body. So you're sinning against other members of Christ's body. You're hurting your own body that you yourself are joined to. So it's like, our right hand starts punching us in the face or something. That's not good. So 13, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. And that's the whole of chapter 8. Very, very short. All right, so there's a lot going on here, and I feel like probably I missed some pieces that will make it make better sense. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? So for St. John Chrysostom, he says on this section, he says, Paul rebukes those who think they are wiser than the rest by saying that everybody possesses knowledge. The self-appointed wise people are nothing special in this respect. If anyone has knowledge but lacks love, not only will he gain nothing more, but also he will be cast down from what he already has. Knowledge is not productive of love. Knowledge does not produce love, but rather it prevents the unwary from acquiring it by puffing him up and elating him. Arrogance causes divisions, but love draws people together and leads to true knowledge, right? So, and here there's a difference in some circles, Greek philosophical circles like the Stoics in particular, which Stoicism seems to have achieved a certain popularity. Again, some ideas of Stoicism like Gnosticism were kind of spreading throughout all of culture. Some elements of Stoicism seem to be becoming like the popular philosophy, and often the Stoics were proud of the fact, they would come to some conclusion about something, some truth, right? And they would almost take pride in acting against social norms, right? So they were the original kind of hippies or something like that. I mean, they tried to not scandalize, but maybe shake up people like, you guys are living according to the old way of thinking, but I'm free. I've realized this truth. And now I realize I don't have to follow your social norms anymore. The problem is, if it leads to arrogance, if it leads to pride, that's the problem. So if I acquire some piece of knowledge, like, this is a temptation for a lot of converts in particular, I think. We're reading all about Orthodoxy, let's say, and we read, in 613, there was a canon that forbid X, right? Oh, okay, so I'm not going to do that anymore, right? Okay, that's fine. The problem then is when it leads to pride. And instead of just me like, okay, I'm not going to do that, whatever it is. Instead, I start telling everybody else in the church that they have to do this, right? And that I'm better because I possess this knowledge, right? And I don't do that, right? And so all you have to conform now to my way of thinking. This is what he's against. And it doesn't really have to do with whether the content of this knowledge is correct or not, right? It may be correct. You may be totally right, but your super correctness, this is what Father Seraphim Rose called it. Any you guys ever hear of Father Seraphim Rose? He's not officially a saint yet, but he died in the 1980s. And anyway, he talks about this. He was a convert, also went through this period of super correctness, super orthodox, right? Where everyone's wrong. You have to defend the truth of orthodoxy because you're the last person who knows it, and blah, blah, blah. Everyone else is ruining it, and you're going to be the defender of the faith, even though no one asked you to. This is like a common trap that we can, converts in particular, that we tend to fall into. So he's saying this kind of pride is what is the problem. It's the way you're doing things that's the problem. And he's saying, for me personally, I have this right. I know the same thing as you know. I can eat meat sacrificed to idols. It doesn't, under certain circumstances, if I have to, if that's what the situation calls for, to. But the criteria of whether I do it or not is different. It's not based on my pride and having some special knowledge. It's based on what is efficacious and salvific for the other, right? How can I be helpful to the other? We're not individuals with rights. We're a community that's saved together. And then there's the old adage, one Christian is no Christian. This is an ancient Christian slogan. One Christian is no Christian. We go to hell alone, but we're saved together. All right, so now chapter 9 seems like he starts talking about something different, but he's not. It's related, because what he's going to talk about now is he's going to turn the example to himself. And this is something he does repeatedly in his letters, is he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So he sets himself as the example. And this was common among teachers at that time, that, it was important. Philosophy and religion were kind of one thing. The ancients had trouble defining Christianity because sometimes they viewed it, philosophy, religion, but it's all kind of the same thing. So philosophy means you come to certain beliefs based on wisdom, and then you act according to those beliefs if you really believe them. So he's putting himself as an example. He says, all right, look at me, for example. So he says, chapter 9, verse 1, am I not an apostle? Am I not free also? So the connection is this idea of freedom and rights, that they're so insistent on their rights all the time. Have I not seen Jesus Christ, our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. Now remember, Paul's being accused since he's left from Corinth 2 years ago at this point. Others have come in claiming to be some kind of Christian apostles, probably from Palestine, and they are questioning Paul. And actually, we don't know the identity of these other apostles who have come in. It's kind of confusing, but they definitely are critical of Paul, that he is not a good speaker. He's throwing out the law, so he's not a good Greek philosopher, and he's not a good Jew either. This is their critique of him. And that's part of the whole problem that was introduced back in chapter 1, that especially probably these wealthy, socially elite, probably they're the ones pushing back most against Paul, because the socially elite Greco-Romans, they despised manual labor. Manual labor was very low to them. And so in their social world, it was common to have these traveling teachers and philosophers, but they were people that should be treated, something like, today, some Harvard professor or something like that. Like, well, this is a person who's going to come in, is going to be well-dressed, well-spoken. He's certainly not, planting corn, in between lectures or something, because this is a dignified man. We wouldn't be associated with someone who wasn't dignified, right? So Paul comes in and he does not fit their description at all. He seems to be not a good speaker, although he's an excellent letter writer. He's not skilled necessarily in all these rhetorical arts that they're interested in. He's not, they don't look at him and he looks like some CEO that they're proud of, right? He's probably, looks like a manual laborer, even though he was very educated. So this is his defense, but the hinge word here that connects everything is the free. So if I'm not an apostle to others, meaning these others who've come after me, who are criticizing me, they say that I'm not really an apostle, I wasn't with the 12, etc. You shouldn't listen to me. But he says, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. In other words, you're Christians now because of me. So I must be an apostle, right? So there must be some validity to what I do. And I don't depend on what they say, on whether they acknowledge me or not. I know that I had a direct revelation of Christ, and I see But I fathered you in the gospel. So you are my spiritual children, and therefore I must be an apostle. So verse 3, my defense to those who examine me is this, and the Greek word is anakrino, which means something like cross-examine, really kind of, they're really kind of prosecuting him almost. My defense, apologia, so this is again, can be like a technical legal term. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife? Or what it really says actually is alafinyaneka, which means sister woman. It can mean a wife. It could just mean sister. Definitely means Christian in some way. So a Christian wife, a Christian woman. Usually we take it as wife, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. But he says, do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles? For example, we know that Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, and that Peter didn't object to healing his mother-in-law. So it goes to his sainthood there. And then so people know that Peter at least had a wife, and he's saying, so do we not also have the right to have a wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, who's Peter? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. All right, so now he's going to go into a different argument related to his rights as an apostle. But the point is this, the connection. Why does he bring this up? One, it's a live issue. They're questioning his authority and apostleship. But the issue is, look at my example. I am an apostle. I do have these rights. I do have the right to be supported. And he's going to argue about this in the next verses. But he's saying, I don't make use of these rights because it would cause conflict. And this is kind of one of the differences between like the Stoics, I was saying, where there was kind of this trend among the Stoics to be countercultural, revolutionary, shocking in a sense, with the rabbinic Jewish tradition that Paul is growing out of, where the rabbis, a lot of time, the rabbis would have fierce debates about interpretation of scripture, but there was a kind of rabbinic Jewish principle that in the end, once the argument had been had and the majority had kind of, won their position, that those in the minority would quit arguing. Right? They would go with the consensus. Why? Not because they had changed their mind, but because they wanted peace, because it was good for the community, not for them as individuals, right? So as individuals, well, I'm not compromising on my principle. I know, and I feel like, again, this is a parallel to modern times. We see this a lot, especially among us converts. I would say, like, there's some special knowledge that we read about on the internet, like, oh, well, such and such is really controlled by the Masons and the Jews and the Zionists and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, I'm not going to participate in this. And I'm, going to criticize this patriarch or this bishop or, so they have this, special knowledge that only certain people have, right? These conspiracy theories or whatever it is. And then they're like, they use it as an opportunity, like, look how smart I am. Look how much knowledge I have. I'm not going to participate in whatever, giving money to this or, it's kind of, or, insisting on my rights. Oh, I don't have to do this and I don't have to do that. No, you don't have to as an individual. But if you're a Christian, one Christian is no Christian, right? So you're talking about the good of the community. So he's kind of appealing to the wealthier ones and saying, like, I'm not even deciding whether you're right or wrong on this. Whether you're right or wrong is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is you're acting in an arrogant and prideful way that is alienating potentially members of the community. It's you're pressuring them to do something they don't feel comfortable doing, and you're tearing down the body of Christ. You're harming the weaker members for whom Christ also died. So he's emphasizing the community, the good of the community as the kind of driving principle, rather than some strict adherence to what's correct. Does that make sense? And he's using himself as an example and saying, he's going to flesh it out more, that, look, I have all these rights as an apostle, you know, the right to be supported, a right to do this, a right to do that, a right to have a wife, but I don't always use them. I don't get up and champion my rights all the time because I'm willing to cede my rights for the good of the community, to keep peace, right? Peace among the community. And this, I think, is really an important message. I mean, it's very frustrating, you know, especially among converts. You know, we're so super Orthodox, and we've got to be right about this, we've got to be right about that. And but if you look at the fruit, you know, sometimes the fruit is just, you know, a bunch of flame wars on internet blog sites and a bunch of other, you know, useless conflict that doesn't contribute to building anything up. All right, so I think we could stop there and we'll continue on with verse 8 next time. You guys have any questions or thoughts or?
Father, how do you feel about converts' reaction? Do you think they go to the extreme when they become Orthodox? Let's say that the persons who are like us, who were born in it, kind of become more lax about our orthodoxy. And so I see this conflict sometimes, that it seems that the converts are more Orthodox than we are, but it kind of makes you sometimes feel like maybe I've been lax about my faith, but not really. You know what I'm saying? We've lived it so long as every day, our daily part of our daily life, from season to season, from year to year, from childhood, that it became just the norm for us, you know. So give me a comment on that.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because, you know, when I became Orthodox here in the U.S., you know, well, I was in different communities, but I kind of some more kind of ethnic older communities, but then I started, you know, kind of. Yeah, I was influenced, let's say, more by kind of convert communities also, you know, where a mission Orthodox church where, you know, it builds up and it's like 99% or 100% converts, you know, has a different character. And so I experienced both of these. And then something was telling me, and I didn't know it at the time, but something was telling me something's off. Like there are two extremes, right? So you have on the one hand, you know, I remember the first time I went to a Greek Orthodox church, and no one talked to me, just ignored me. And then maybe after a couple of weeks when I was there, finally this very, very nice guy became a friend. He said, "What village are you from?" And I said, well, you know, I'm an American, and I mean, I forget what I said, from Virginia, and he was like, no, you know, I mean, what village, you know, Horio in Greece are your ancestors from? I'm like, well, you know, I don't have any Greek ancestry. I converted, and he just kind of, he kind of stopped, like there was this shock. You could see the wheels turning, like, how do I compute this? And then he said, it's okay, you can stay, you know, you're welcome anyway. And I said, oh, thanks, I think. So, and it's so a very kind of you know, nationalistic, you know, so there's that extreme where, yeah, this is just a country club for Greeks and we say some stuff about God once in a while. And or the other extreme that I also experienced was, you know, converts who, you know, are tithing mint and, you know, I mean, just like a super correctness for every detail, which is fine on its own, but that almost always turns into condemnation, judgment, criticism of others, right? And that's where, you know, that's the rub. And so something was telling me, like, there's gotta be another choice besides these two extremes, right? And something told me, like, you gotta go to an Orthodox country and try to absorb, how do people actually live these contradictions, you know? And so then I had that experience, and then, you know, coming back here to the States and being in, you know, Greek churches here in the States, I'm convinced, really, and this is what I honestly, truly believe, that both sides need each other. You know, that the answer always in Orthodoxy is the middle way, the royal way, and that but somehow we have to get, you know, we have to be the bee, you know, we have to have this mentality, not an arrogant mentality, but one that's based on love. and try to extract what's good from the other, right? So the cradle should be looking at the zeal and the enthusiasm of the new convert, and the convert should be looking at the moderation, the sobriety of the cradle Orthodox's faith, right? Because then, a cradle Orthodox, they might not know anything about Orthodoxy, but they're not going to leave, right? Whereas you get a convert, 1 minute, and this I've seen this many times. 1 minute he's an expert on Orthodoxy. He's the next Athanasius the Great who's going to defend Orthodoxy, and then 6 months later, he's Catholic, or he's Jehovah's Witness or something.
Yes, yes.
So both extremes are not good. When they're in an extreme, they need to really, ideally, they need to learn from each other. And I think we have that, like in Birmingham, I think we have quite a few converts, different kinds of converts, through marriage or through reading or whatever. And, the pastor's goal, Paul's goal here is, how do we learn from each other, right? Because what's important is the community, that we're all saved together. So, you can be right all you want, but if you run over your fellow Christian in the parish because you're going on and on about, you can't eat fish on these days or something, you haven't accomplished anything. You've just led to disunity. And so Paul is saying love is the better way. And he's not going to say, we have to, like I was saying earlier, it's not just like, well, you don't want to offend anybody ever. It's not about offending somebody. I mean, sometimes you can't help it, but it's about pressuring them to do something that they don't believe is right, or is not what they're accustomed to. They're not ready yet to take that step, right? And so you're just causing disunity. And
it takes time to really live the Orthodox way, Father, because if you're coming from the outside, it takes years before you feel very comfortable with the daily fasting and going to church and acknowledging this saint and that saint. And right. I mean, that is a way of life. And so unless you grew up with it, it's a whole new ball game for the convert.
Right. It feels like putting on a new pair of jeans that aren't broken in, right? At first, It's odd, it's uncomfortable, this can't be, then over time it feels natural. And I think that's the kind of core, that's the crux of the issue, is that, how do you bring in converts, right? We have converts here, thank God. Every year we have a few converts that God sends our way. So the struggle is, how do you teach them the kind of rules of Orthodoxy, right? Like when we come into a church, we make our cross, we kiss the icon, we don't sit with our legs crossed during church, all these things that have a deeper reason. It's not just some random rule, right? It's because behind it, there's this principle of reverence, et cetera, et cetera. But so how do you balance that? Because these are new people coming in, they have no context. You have to give them some kind of framework, right? Well, normally we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And the danger at that stage is for them to absolutize it, right? Like, it's got to be exactly this way. And, I don't know how many times, well, Father so-and-so never did it that way. I mean, that's, God, you have to be wrong. Like, okay, calm down. It's not that serious. So you have to give them some structure, but then how do you get them not to absolutize it and make it an ideology, right? Then that just comes with time, that you make mistakes, and then over time, it becomes like second nature. But you can't also not give them anything. You can't just say, oh, just do whatever you want, just leave them like, they're wandering around the church like, what do I stand? Do I sit? Don't make my cross, da, da, da. So it's a delicate balance between the two.